Kamala Harris opposes reparations for Black Americans. During her interview with the National Association for Black Journalists, Kamala Harris completely skirted the issue. That has been gaining momentum, driven by the broad support nationwide from the Black community. Let's take a look.
I want to switch gears to racial justice, Madam Vice President. Last month, you eulogized Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee.
Yeah.
Jackson Lee's signature bill, one of a few, was H.R. 40, which would create a commission to study the history of U.S. slavery and study the issue of reparations. She introduced H.R. 40 every session of Congress, taking up the mantle from Congressman John Conyers. This is a bill that you have co-sponsored as a U.S. Senator. Yet, this has, despite the fact that this has been, similar commissions have been created on the state level and on the local level, is yet to pass in Congress, let alone come out of committee. Congresswoman Jackson Lee, Congresswoman Barbara Lee, and other advocates have called for President Biden to take executive action to create this commission. Would you, as president, take executive action to create this commission, or do you believe that it should happen in Congress?
Well, first of all, as you mentioned, Sheila Jackson Lee, she was an extraordinary leader who we just recently lost, and she was a friend and a real champion for so many issues. So I feel compelled to say that about her. On the issue of what we need to do going forward, look, first of all, we just need to speak truth about history, in spite of the fact that some people would try and erase history and try and teach our children otherwise. We need to speak truth about the generational impact of our history in terms of the generational impact of slavery, the generational impact of redlining, of Jim Crow law. I could go on and on and on. These are facts that have had impact. And we need to...
So in other words, she is calling for a commission to discuss facts that are clear, that no one denies, that there are clear disparities among the treatment of Blacks in this country and minorities. You saw my video on when Michael Jackson helped me get a job, a remote job, $120,000 remote job, and all of the issues that I encountered going up against white America, because I was in a team of minorities. They basically took apart the team, didn't take apart any other team in the organization for which I was working. I did not want to believe it. Nonetheless, she wants to simply defer this to Congress so they can talk about it, so they can remind people. How much reminders were required for them to send the billions of dollars that they sent overseas for the war in Ukraine? I mean, listen, what's happening over there, I'm not discounting it. Nonetheless, were committees held? I mean, and she's not even talking about, she says that we have to have this discussion. Where is this discussion taking place?
We need to speak truth about it. And we need to speak truth about it in a way that is about deriving solutions. And frankly, I think that we, and part of that is studying it to figure out exactly.
Studying it. What about paying?
What we need to do. But part of what we can do right now is, for example, what I'm talking about in terms of building an opportunity economy, which is addressing explicitly the obstacles that historically and currently exist and dealing with them. Student loan debt, medical debt, bias in home appraisals.
That has nothing to do with reparations.
What we need to do in terms of dealing with an issue that I have championed for years, Black maternal mortality, which is the fact that Black women are 3 to 4 times more likely to die in connection with childbirth than...
Has nothing to do with reparations, student loan debt, medical debt, appraisals. People are trying to erase history, right? What are you talking about? Everyone knows that slavery, African Americans have been enslaved in the United States from 1619 to 1865, murdered, brutalized, made victims of genocide. The policy of 40 acres and a mule was Union General William T. Sherman's Special Field Order number 15. The islands from Charleston, South Carolina, the abandoned rice fields along the rivers for 30 miles back from the sea and the country bordering the St. Johns River are reserved and set apart for the settlement of the Negroes, now made freely the acts of war and the proclamation of the President of the United States. Section 2 specifies that these communities, moreover, would be governed entirely by black people themselves. With this order, 400,000 acres of land, a strip of coastline stretching from Charleston, South Carolina to the St. Johns River in Florida, including Georgia's Sea Islands and the mainland, 30 miles in from the coast, as Barton Mayer's reports, would be redistributed to the newly freed slaves. The next push for reparations took place at the turn of the century. One bill introduced in the U.S. Senate in 1894 would have granted direct payments of up to $500 to all ex-slaves, plus monthly pensions ranging from $4 to $15. This and several bills died in congressional committees. So she wants to send the issue of reparations to die, just as they clearly do in congressional committees in the past. So she wants to repeat. If you don't know your history, you are doomed to repeat it. It demanded $500 million from American churches and synagogues for their role in perpetrating slavery during the Civil War, during the 60s, in the 80s. A new call arose for black reparations. The Supreme Court ordered the federal government to pay 8 Sioux Indian tribes $122 million to compensate for the illegal seizure of tribal lands in 1977. Then in 1988, Congress approved the payment of $1.25 billion to 60,000 Japanese American citizens who had been interned in prison camps during World War II. Council member Ray Jenkins in 1989 called for $40 billion federal education fund for black college and trade school students. About the same time, a conference of black state legislators meeting in New Orleans backed the idea. And it goes on and on. Nothing in what she is saying addresses what the NAACP is calling for. Reparations would involve a national apology, rights to the cannabis industry, financial payment, social service benefits, land grants to every descendant of an enslaved African American and black person, a descendant of those living in the United States, including during American slavery until the Jim Crow era, because slavery involved kidnapping, barbarism, and the stripping of language, culture, and heritage. Many black people are unaware of their specific African heritage and which country, in fact, their ancestors were stolen from. Listen, and that's why they're traveling from where my family originates. Look at San Basilio de Palenque. I'll just include that note right here. Often referred to by the locals simply as Palenque, is a Palenque village, and this was actually the first free town established by former slaves in the Americas and lies 50 kilometers from the popular port city of Cartagena. And people in this country, they're traveling over there and learning because they still speak African dialect. We keep it funky with ours.
Other women. And we know that the reasons for that include disparities that pre-exist her pregnancy, including disparities that exist in the system during her pregnancy. So all of those things must be addressed.
But do you have a position on whether that should happen, this commission should happen through executive order or via Congress?
I think Congress ultimately will have the ability.
So she wants to defer this to Congress. Pass the ball to the other person. Let them mess it up. Why does she take ownership? If you are president of the United States, clothed in immense power, why is it that, at the very least, put something together through executive action so you can bring light to the issue? Because once you are president, everything that you do and say is of public concern, is of national importance. That's why people started to pay attention more to Donald Trump. Now, every time that he tweeted something, it made the news because he's now president of the United States.
To do this work. I'm not discounting the importance of any executive action, but ultimately Congress. Because if you're going to talk about it in any substantial way, there will be hearings, there will be...
If you want to talk about it.
A level of public education and dialogue that, and I think that was part of the...
What can you do in your power in order to push this issue that 77% of Black Americans support?
The spirit behind the congressional action thus far to ensure that everyone can participate in this conversation in a way that elevates knowledge about history.
Elevates knowledge about history. Elevates knowledge. We know the history. We know how people were brutalized, were murdered, were raped. We know it very clearly and still encounter issues. Yesterday I was trying to make an appointment. You could clearly see that just because of my race, just because I'm colored, they were trying to set up all kinds of obstacles for me to simply set up an appointment for my wife's annual physical.
That are the impetus of this conversation. Especially, again, when people are trying to deny history. When people are, so-called leaders are saying that enslaved people benefited from slavery. I mean, let's talk about the delta here in terms of the work that needs to be done.
That's not going to drive this, whether people are denying slavery. How are you going to deny slavery? It happened. It's
Do you
history.
support reparations for Black people?
Well, listen, again, we had over 200 years of slavery. We had Jim Crow for almost a century. We had legalized discrimination and segregation, and now we have segregation and discrimination that is not legal but still exists and is a barrier to progress. We have disparities around housing. We have disparities around education. We have disparities around income. And we have to recognize that everybody did not start out on an equal footing in this country. And in particular, Black people have not. And so we have got to recognize that and do something about that and give folks a lift up. That's why, for example, I'm proposing the LIFT Act. Give people who are making $100,000 or less as a family a tax credit, which will benefit and uplift 60% of Black families who are in poverty.
So by default, it affects Black families, but there's not a particular policy for African Americans that you would explore.
A tax credit. That's what she says will satisfy reparations for which Black Americans are demanding.
But no, if you look at the reality of who will benefit from certain policies, when you take into account that they're not starting at the same place and they're not starting on equal footing, it will directly benefit Black children, Black families, Black homeowners, because the disparities are so significant. So if we focus on the specific issues that have resulted in the greatest disparities, and we understand that that's part of why we're doing it. Listen, the reality also is this: any policy that will benefit Black people will benefit all of society. Let's be clear about that. Let's really be clear about that. So I'm not going to sit here and say I'm going to do something that's only going to benefit Black people. No, because whatever benefits that Black family will benefit that community and society as a whole in the country. Right?
The LIFT Act established a program of the Department of Housing and Urban Development in consultation with the Department of the Treasury to sponsor low fixed rate 20-year mortgages for the first generation home buyers who have incomes equal to or less than 120% of their area median income. She's proposing a $50,000 tax credit for startup businesses. You have to be able to account for your expenses operating a small business regardless. This is H.R. 40. This is the bill to which the journalists were referring during the interview. This bill establishes the commission to study and develop reparation proposals for African Americans. The commission shall examine slavery and discrimination in the colonies in the United States from 1619 to the present and recommend appropriate remedies. The commission shall identify the role of the federal and state government supporting the institution of slavery, forms of discrimination in the public and private sectors against freed slaves and their descendants, and lingering negative effects of slavery on living African Americans and society. This is just to talk about it. And I'd like to see all of the commissions and everything that they had to do before sending money out overseas to help all of these other countries. What happened to America first? A Reuters Ipsos survey found that slightly more than half of respondents identifying as Democrats support reparations. The divide is equal. The poll found that 74% of Black Americans favor reparations. Nonetheless, they don't care about it. On neither side, no one's talking about reparations. Nonetheless, more than a third of Black Americans want it. Is this a democracy? Are they taking exactly what you are demanding into account? Or are they just saying, no, this is what you could use? Here, let me just break you off with a tax credit right here. Let me just forgiveness for which you can't even provide. They can't even do that. They can't even do forgiveness. And they're talking about that they want to hold a conversation. What, to justify this? Is not justified by any means. It's not justified after over a third. Is this a democracy, or is this just basically parents telling us, no, this is not good for you, this is good for you? Out the gate, the Federal Reserve came out of their pockets $13.7 billion to bail out corporate America after the pandemic. Did that have to go to committee? No, none of that went out to committee. How about an emergency fund for Black Americans, for people who have been suffering these disparities? Now, I'm not even talking about whether people believe this is right, whether people believe it's wrong. All I'm saying is that you've got over a third of Black Americans, a gargantuan voting bloc demanding for reparations, and they skirt around the issue. They don't even make it a hot issue, a hot topic. They mentioned it over at the National Association for Black Journalists because they're Black journalists. Nonetheless, where is it? How do both candidates stand in regards to reparations? That's what I want to see. Watch the video you see on the screen right now. You know it.